deadly outbreak. As the world continues to fight the coronavirus, the Trump administration's task force holds its first meeting. We're at the White House. Ready for the president. A gathering of conservatives near the nation's capital is preparing to hear tomorrow from President Donald Trump. Clergy abuse. The Vatican launches a task force to help handle cases of sexual misconduct. And food for thought. On this first Friday of Lent, we hear about the importance of fasting. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, February 28th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. The number of countries hit by the coronavirus has grown to nearly 60. Globally, more than 83,000 people have been sickened and nearly 2,800 have died. We'll have an update on the impact of the virus around the world in just a few minutes, but fortunately, as of now, the virus isn't spreading rapidly here in the U.S. Correspondent Owen Jensen reports now from the White House. Owen.
Tracy, U.S. officials are trying to maintain a sense of calm. This as sales of face masks soar and the markets once again take another pummeling.
Projecting a sense of calm, Vice President Mike Pence convened his first meeting as head of the coronavirus task force.
In the days ahead, we're going to make sure that the full resources of the federal government continue to be brought to bear in confronting the coronavirus.
And when asked who's in charge?
I'm leading the task force. We'll continue to rely on the Secretary's role as chairman of the task force and the leader of Health and Human Services.
The stakes could not be higher in health and finance. More companies are warning investors that their finances will take a hit. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow says no one should panic and that the U.S. economy is sound. He told us he's impressed by the president's handling of the issue, like the way he spoke out Wednesday.
I think it was one of his best news conferences I've ever seen him give, and he laid it out. Again, really historic and unprecedented actions. And this is a government-wide effort. And so I think folks are going to look at that and say, you know what, he was doing his job very well.
President Trump will appeal to voters at a rally tonight in South Carolina ahead of that state's primary tomorrow. And Democratic presidential candidates like Bernie Sanders are on the ground in South Carolina trying to gather support and push back against the president.
It is absolutely imperative that we defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country.
Real Clear Politics says Joe Biden has a double-digit lead over Bernie Sanders in South Carolina. Of course, they both face an uphill battle against President Trump, who rallies in North Carolina on Monday. Tracy?
Okay, thank you, Owen. Correspondent Owen Jensen reporting tonight from the White House. Thank you again. Hundreds of delegates are up for grabs on Super Tuesday next week. EWTN News Nightly will be bringing you comprehensive coverage as more than a dozen states head to the polls. And stay with us next week as we travel to California, North Carolina, and Vermont with Super Tuesday coverage. We'll have reports and analysis each evening, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. As Owen mentioned, President Trump rallies in South Carolina tonight for re-election, but it's the speech that he'll give tomorrow night just outside of the nation's capital that many conservatives are waiting to hear. Correspondent Mark Irons reports now from CPAC.
Tracy, tomorrow's speech by the president will cap off the Conservative Political Action Conference. And just ahead of Super Tuesday, we spoke with someone at the heart of the president's re-election campaign. He's confident supporters here are positioning the president for a big win in November.
At CPAC, the president's inner circle, from the vice president to White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, is making the case for another 4 years of President Trump. Today we spoke with his 2020 campaign manager, Brad Parscale.
We're running a great campaign. I think the president's proud of it. We're all across the country, 17 states. We're almost in every metric, 10 times, the size. We're prepared for any of the candidates coming in. I think the president's in a good place to win in 2020.
Parscale tells us the Trump re-election effort has been underway since the president won the White House in 2016.
As the president said, he didn't take his foot off the gas after 2016. He knew that was the start of the fight, not the end of the fight. And we built a campaign to be prepared.
But 4 years ago, there were major concerns among conservatives here at CPAC about candidate Donald Trump becoming president. And the frontrunner for the Republican nomination even canceled his scheduled speech. The group tweeted, "Very disappointed Donald Trump has decided at the last minute to drop out of CPAC. His choice sends a clear message to conservatives." Today we ran into former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, who told us about the CPAC change of heart.
The people didn't know President Trump at that time. He was talking about what he would do. He was making a lot of promises. In 2020, people can come here and say this president delivered on everything he said he was going to do, and the country's moving in a great direction.
Former Republican Congressman Dave Bratt tells us he hasn't found any Never Trump conservatives at this year's conference.
And that is amazing, right? So I hope they're truly on board. But yeah, the tide shifted.
You can expect the president's remarks tomorrow to resemble a campaign rally speech. One difference could be the length. At last year's CPAC, the president spoke for over 2 hours, and that speech became the longest of his presidency. At CPAC, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union, joins me now from CPAC. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Tracy.
So, Matt, tell me, what makes this year's CPAC different from years past?
Well, you know, the first thing that's obviously different is this is really the start of the presidential campaign. Come Saturday with the South Carolina primary, Americans will have a much clearer view of who that Democratic nominee is going to be. I think the second thing that is interesting about this CPAC, besides being the biggest we've sold out days ago, is the fact that conservatives and Republicans are basically joyful people. They think the president has done a great job implementing the agenda he ran on. They think the Republican Party, which most of these people are, but not all of them, as we're a nonprofit, they believe that the Republican Party is fighting back aggressively, and they're really, really worried. And our theme of this year's CPAC is America versus socialism. They are worried about America slipping into socialism.
Yeah, Matt, I was just going to ask you about that, the theme, why you chose America versus socialism. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, we're seeing these Democratic candidates really be for some extreme things, post-birth abortion, really upending the Constitution, packing the Supreme Court, getting rid of the Electoral College, health insurance for people who come here illegally, decriminalizing coming to the country illegally, raising taxes, absconding with people's savings accounts. I mean, it's some pretty radical stuff. And I think for those of us who believe that the family is the building block for a healthy society and a growing economy, their positions on these questions of the family and religious freedom are very, very alarming. You know, socialism is not just an economic ism or mentality or philosophy. It's a whole new way of thinking about the individual. We believe as Christians that the individual is imbued with rights by God, not by government. And socialists just have a whole different view of who you get your rights from. And of course, they have a whole different view about whether there really even is a God.
I know we just talked about the shift more towards socialism in the Democratic Party. I know there are some that aren't on board with that shift, with those ideas and policies. Do you think that we'll see a return to more moderate Democrats, or do you think it's going to continue on that track?
Well, there are no moderate Democrats running for president. Every one of those Democratic presidential candidates have almost the exact same policy positions. It's just how fast you get to full-on socialism and whether or not you claim the mantle of socialism. But there's not a single candidate running for the Democratic nomination who wants to regulate abortions, any abortions. I just think that's a tragedy. How about even just making sure taxpayer funding doesn't go to pay for abortions? How about making sure our taxpayer dollars doesn't go to pay for abortions overseas? They're not for any of those policies. I think that's radical. I think that's antithetical to where the American people are.
Well, Matt, I know you mentioned, just shifting gears here for a minute, you mentioned there are a lot of people there this year. What's the mood among the folks at CPAC right now, and then going into the election?
Well, like I said, they're wary about the fact that one of the two major American parties could slip into socialism. But beyond that, they're joyful people. These are the happiest people. By the way, we have Mass every day at CPAC, which is a first. But these are people that are coming together to try to find like-minded people to work with, to make friendships with. Conservatives don't believe in safe places, but they do believe it's important to come together, have fellowship, and be proud of their country. And what I see when I go up and down the hallways of CPAC is a lot of happy Americans that just simply want to make sure their country doesn't slip into socialism.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union. Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks, Tracy.
A setback to President Donald Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration. A federal appeals court is halting the White House policy of requiring asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases are heard. It's just temporary, and the judges only decided on whether to let the policy take effect while asylum claims are being challenged. And President Trump is sending Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to the Middle East for the signing of a peace agreement with the Taliban. Pulling out of Afghanistan was one of the president's campaign promises. A statement from President Trump today says American troops went to Afghanistan 19 years ago to root out terrorists responsible for 9/11. And he thanks the American service members who served in Afghanistan. Around the world, Nigeria is reporting its first case of the coronavirus, and it is the first in sub-Saharan Africa. In Switzerland, the Geneva Auto Show has been canceled after authorities there banned large events. In neighboring Italy, cases jumped to over 880, up from 400 just a few days ago. 21 have died from the coronavirus in Italy, and a dozen towns near Milan remain in quarantine. Fear of the virus is causing a global run on sales of face masks. Thousands in South Korea are lining up to buy them, and Amazon is policing its site to stop price gouging. However, doctors say people who aren't sick don't need to wear them. World financial markets fell yesterday and are dropping again today. This has been the worst week for stock markets since 2008. 1 year after the Vatican's sex abuse summit, Pope Francis launches a child protection task force.
In many ways, it's a proactive way for the Church to not just leave Episcopal conferences without the support they need, but also to provide them with a group of people, a group of trained people who can actually assist them locally to do this.
Andrew Asaparty is coordinator of the task force and head of the Safeguarding Commission in Malta. He says accountability at all levels is a priority for the Church, no matter who it is. He will provide quarterly updates to the Vatican's Secretariat of State. Father Hans Zollner, member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and president of the Center for Child Protection, joins us now from Rome. Father, thank you for joining us. So how will the task force work with the bishops' conferences and the diocese?
The task force is meant to help bishops' conferences especially, but probably also beyond that at a certain point, to revise their guidelines, including the new legislation that has come about over the last 12 months, especially in reference to the new universal law that Pope Francis established on 1st of June last year, and the new norms concerning the abolition of the pontifical secret in regard to the dealing with cases of allegations of abuse against minors. So these new norms have to be included in the guidelines, and canon lawyers will look at the guidelines that bishops' conferences can send in, will help them to update them, and then will help them to approve them in the bishops' conferences and in all concerned authorities.
What will the role be for the Center for Child Protection with the Vatican's task force?
The Center for Child Protection doesn't really work directly with the task forces at this point. However, we are co-hosting together with the new director for the coordination of the task force, Andrew Azzopardi, who is the safeguarding officer for the Maltese Bishops' Conference. We are hosting together a conference at the end of June, at the beginning of July, and so we will have certainly a very close collaboration with him, and we will learn about the necessities that this process will show in terms of helping also bishops' conferences to train people, to educate safeguarding officers and intervention officers for their diocese and for their institutions.
I know this is just a step in a long process on the protection of children, but what can we expect next?
What we are all expecting very soon from now is this publication of the so-called vademecum that was already announced at the end of the summit, of the so-called summit, of the meeting of the presidents of the bishops' conferences at the end of February last year, which would give indications to bishops how to conduct canonical investigations, how to cooperate with civil authorities, and what to do so that the canonical trials can be held according to the norms of the Church.
Father Hans Zollner, member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and president of the Center for Child Protection, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you, Tracy.
Fighting in northern Syria is escalating, with 33 Turkish soldiers killed from Syrian shelling, and Turkey responded by firing on hundreds of Syrian targets. The head of NATO is telling Russia to stop airstrikes on civilians.
I call on them to stop their offensive, to respect international law, and to back UN efforts for a peaceful solution.
NATO is holding emergency talks, and President Erdogan of Turkey called Russian President Putin on the phone today. Russia is backing Syria's offensive on the rebels. 1 million refugees fled the fighting, and Turkey's president is threatening to no longer hold migrants who hope to flee to Europe. Prayers for victims of religious riots in India. Muslims returned for weekly prayers in the capital of Delhi today. Over 40 people have now been killed after Hindu mobs and Muslims attacked each other. The trigger was a new law granting citizenship to immigrants, except Muslims. But tensions have been rising in India since the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party lost local elections earlier this month. Coming up, a church leader weighs in on poll numbers, saying the faithful do not consider abortion to be intrinsically evil. The Catholic Diocese of Buffalo filed for bankruptcy earlier today. It is another step in recovering from a clergy misconduct scandal. The diocese is facing hundreds of lawsuits and Vatican intervention. In December, Bishop Richard Malone stepped down. He was under intense pressure for withholding the names of dozens of accused priests. The Buffalo Diocese has already paid out $18 million to over 100 victims. Democrat lawmakers in Virginia are rolling back abortion restrictions that were put in place by Republicans. The State House voted yesterday to eliminate a 24-hour waiting period and also the requirement for pregnant women to view an ultrasound. The governor is set to sign the new abortion law. Democrats won control of Virginia's General Assembly last year after 2 decades of control by Republicans. And we take another look now at our EWTN News Real Clear Opinion Research poll of Catholic voters in America. Tonight, their views on vital moral issues that involve intrinsically evil acts, those considered by the Church as always immoral at all times, regardless of intention or circumstances. The poll found 72% of Catholics surveyed believe certain acts are intrinsically evil, but less than half would say abortion, euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide would fit that definition. Joining me now by Skype from Kansas City is Archbishop Joseph Naumann, chairman of the USCCB Committee on Pro-Life Activities. Your Excellency, welcome back to the show. We appreciate you being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you and your viewers.
Well, I know that you've seen our latest EWTN News Real Clear Opinion research poll, which finds that a wide majority of Catholics accept the Church's teachings on intrinsic evil, but also don't consider abortion or euthanasia intrinsically evil. What was your reaction to that when you saw that?
Well, I mean, it reveals to us we have a lot of education to do with our own people. I mean, I think it's always important with these polls, though, to look at who are they talking about Catholics that go to Mass regularly or not? And the statistics vary greatly when you get to that. So part of what it says, we need to do better at evangelization efforts, too. If people are in church, if they're being formed, they're much more likely to understand the Church's teaching and embrace it.
And why was it important for you and your fellow bishops at your annual meeting last fall in Baltimore to reiterate that abortion is the preeminent priority of our time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it because it is. And, you know, I think there are many issues that are important to us as Catholics. And in our document, we outline those, and we care about them, and we're passionate about all of them. But this particular issue is so important because it attacks life when it's most vulnerable. It happens within the context of the family. It destroys the most sacred human bond, that of a mother and child. And the sheer numbers of it, over 60 million abortions since 1973, and each one of those children have a mother and father that are scarred by the abortion experience. So it's staggering just the scope of it. And so this is something that the bishops have said for decades. We felt it was important to reiterate that that remains the case.
Your Excellency, what do you think that we can do, as a church to teach and inform Catholics properly on important issues like this?
I think some of the most important education goes on one-to-one, person-to-person. And so I think to be well-informed ourselves, and then in our conversations with family, with friends, with coworkers, to not be afraid to talk about this issue and to feel we're equipped, we're knowledgeable enough to really speak to it about it's not, when we were meeting with Pope Francis at our Limina, one of the things he said, this is a human rights issue first and foremost. Yes, our faith speaks about it, but it's a fundamental human rights issue that we can't take the life of an innocent child.
Well, thank you so much for your input. We really appreciate that. Is there anything else that you think would be important for our viewers to know, either about what you gleaned from our poll or anything else right now?
Well, no, I think it tells all of us that we need to, who care about human life and its sanctity, that we need to ramp up our efforts at educating. Also, the bishops are launching this campaign, Walking with Moms in Need. And so if we can't protect children by the law currently, we can save a lot of them by our care for them and care for mothers. So that's another way to get involved and to help change our culture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Archbishop Joseph Naumann, Chairman of the USCCB Committee on Pro-Life Activities. Thank you again, Your Excellency.
Thanks. God bless.
Up next, a closer look at how fasting can help the faithful. Earlier this week, we commemorated Ash Wednesday. It is one of 2 days each year where Catholics are expected to fast. The other is Good Friday. One author says fasting more often can lead to spiritual and physical rewards. In his book, Eat, Fast, Feast, Jay Richards says, quote, unless you have a medical condition that prevents it, fasting is good for your body, your mind, and your soul. You do not have to take that on faith. You can prove it to yourself in just a few weeks. And Jay Richards joins us now. He is a research assistant professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America and also host of A Force for Good right here on EWTN. Jay, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so let's talk about this book. I know that fasting is really popular now. It's a popular diet trend. But tell us about your book and what you're talking about specifically and how that's different.
Well, I wanted to combine all of the historical and spiritual wisdom of fasting, which is really anchored in the Christian tradition, with all this new scientific evidence for its physical benefits. And that was a sort of surprise to me to discover that there are literally hundreds of scientific articles about the therapeutic benefits of fasting, just at the time, quite frankly, that Catholics have mostly given up, except for maybe residual fasting, a little bit that we still do.
Yeah. What do you mean by fasting, and are there different ways to fast?
There are. And so the primary definition of fasting just means not eating for some amount of time. So I really sort of dig in. I say, look, let's remember that, because that was the primary definition. That's what Jesus did for 40 days in the desert. That's what the early church did on Wednesdays and Fridays. And then the secondary definition would be some kind of really strong abstinence, say from an entire type of food for some amount of time, like Christians often do during Lent or Advent. But it's primarily not eating, secondarily strong abstinence from certain kinds of food.
Yeah, and what way is, fasting, is it good for your body and your soul? Because a lot of people think, and we were taught fasting that's not good for you.
No, that's right. In fact, I taught my children this. I learned this in college, that if you don't eat, your body will go into starvation mode, you'll get rid of muscle, you'll store fat. It's actually not true at all. That does happen if you restrict calories for a long period of time, like most traditional diets do. But in fasting, we actually know that when you fast, after about a day, your body actually goes into high gear. It kicks up the hormones that give you energy. It actually kicks up growth hormone, human growth hormone, which preserves your lean muscle mass. It actually does this for about 3 days. It takes 5 days of water water-only fasting for your metabolism to get back to normal. So this is why you wouldn't be surprised that there are now physicians that are treating type 2 diabetes and obesity with fasting, not dieting.
Wow, you have a chapter in your book that talks about fasting clearing your mind. Can you explain that?
Well, this is actually how I discovered it. I had, by accident, I had a medical procedure, had to go 36 hours without eating. Thought this is going to be terrible, but I had been actually eating a very low-carb diet, and I decided I'll work out at the end of this and see what happens. And I did. I felt strong, but more than anything, I felt lucid. My mind was utterly clear, and so like anyone, I went to the computer and I Googled, okay, fasting and mental clarity. Well, it turns out there's a known physical effect. When you don't eat for a certain period of time, your body gets rid of all the sugars and carbohydrates it's using, and then your liver starts producing these things called ketones from fat. It's another kind of fuel that your cells can use. Turns out your brain really likes to use ketones, and fasting is really the easiest way to kick that into gear. So I experienced it honestly by accident.
Wow, well, we don't have much time left, but I really want to get this question in. Do you have any advice for people when it comes to fasting, if they're planning on doing it for the first time?
Absolutely. Ease into it. Don't try a 3-day water-only fast. Start by eating ketogenically, a lot of fat and low carbs, and then slowly narrow the time window over the weeks in which you eat from 8 to 4, even to maybe 1 hour during the day, and then you'll be in a position after a few weeks to really try a hardcore fast.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Jay. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
And we thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.